Hello everyone and welcome to a GCSE History Revision tutorial. We're going to look at some paper 2 material today for the Superpower Relations and the Cold War section, and within that we're going to look at a Cold War crisis and we're going to focus on Berlin, particularly from 1958 to 1961. So let's look firstly why Berlin mattered so much, to put some context on the crisis. Firstly, as the capital city of Nazi Germany, the city had symbolic value for both sides, but particularly the Soviets, who had fought incredibly hard to take control of the city at the end of the Second World War. The city had been divided into sectors at the end of the war between the Soviets and America, Britain and France, just as Germany had been as a whole. But Berlin was situated deep inside Soviet-controlled territory of Eastern Germany, and therefore they saw that the Western presence in Berlin carried a military, security and propaganda threat to communist-controlled Eastern Germany. And it didn't take long for relations between both sides to get very bad, and Stalin, the Soviet leader, had blockaded Berlin in 1948 up to 1949, forcing the Allied powers to airlift supplies into Western Berlin to try to keep their sectors of the city supplied. And as the years had passed, the West invested in and united its sectors in West Germany and in Berlin itself. So this meant that the western sector of Berlin was recovering economically and starting to thrive, and you could compare that to the eastern side, the communist controlled side, where the Russians had taken resources away. So the difference between the two sides was becoming increasingly stark, and this had contributed to a refugee crisis where tens of thousands of people were using Berlin as a way to escape from communist controlled territory. By 1961, in total 4 million people had left, and it was particularly young and talented and educated people that were leaving, and we call this the refugee crisis. So let's have a look at how events fit together here. The Berlin blockade and airlift of 1948 we can call the first Berlin crisis, and in the years that followed we have Western investment into their sectors of Germany. And in 1955, West Germany had become a member of NATO. Now that increased the direct military threat that West Germany and also West Berlin posed towards the Soviet Union. And then 2 years later, in 1957, West Germany joined the European Economic Community, which again would speed their economic recovery and would only exacerbate the refugee crisis as people fled for freedom and also for better material conditions. Now our video is going to focus on the events around the Second Berlin crisis, lasting from 1958 to 1961. We'll unpack the 4 events that you can see signified here of Khrushchev's ultimatum, the summits at Paris and then Vienna, and then lastly the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Which we're going to take as the end point of that crisis. As tensions started to decrease, JFK, the American president, made a speech at the Berlin Wall in 1963. This is a symbolic Cold War moment, but it kind of marks a reduction in tension around Berlin, despite the fact that tensions in the Cold War continued. So we're going to focus on 4 sections here in the Second Berlin crisis. We'll look firstly at Khrushchev's ultimatum in 1958. So let's look firstly at Nikita Khrushchev's ultimatum of 1958. Now 2 years into his premiership, Khrushchev, prompted by increasing numbers of refugees using Berlin as a gateway out of communist-controlled territory, and increasingly concerned about the security threat and the symbolic value of the place, gave the West 6 months to clear out of West Berlin. Otherwise, he said he would take them out by force. He accused the Western nations of breaking previous agreements and of bad faith. Now, the reaction in the West was quite prompt. President Eisenhower of the USA attempted to negotiate, and immediately diplomacy started up on both sides. The USA in particular did not want to risk war in Western Europe or Central Europe at this stage. And as part of those diplomatic moves, Khrushchev made an informal visit to America in 1960, which went quite well. But both sides have different positions about what was going to happen with Berlin, and neither position was one where they could compromise on. Very simply, the Russians were desperate for the West to leave, and the West was determined to stay. So let's look next at the Paris Summit of 1960. So let's look at the Paris Summit of 1960. Now, this summit went disastrously wrong and contributed to increased tensions between the two sides, again centred around Berlin. So days before the summit, a USA spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory, and the Soviet Union demanded an apology for this and demanded that such flights should stop. America refused to apologise, and so at a preliminary meeting before the summit, there was a furious confrontation between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, and the summit was called off. Khrushchev dramatically rounded on journalists when this was announced. Now, the impact of this failure showed how Berlin was a centre point for superpower tension. There were many issues between the two sides, but Berlin was one that concentrated both of their attention. Yet despite the failure of the Paris summit, diplomatic moves continued and another summit was arranged for next year. And this might give you an idea that both sides, although very hostile towards each other, clearly didn't want to go to war over Berlin. Both wanted ultimately to avoid confrontation, but still both sides were determined to get their own way. So let's look next at the Vienna summit 1 year later. Now, by this time, Eisenhower had been replaced by JFK as president, and Khrushchev was hopeful that he could exploit the new president's naivety and lack of experience. But JFK himself was determined not to appear weak. Now, he had just had a disastrous intervention in Cuba that had gone very badly wrong at the Bay of Pigs, and he had publicly reasserted that he would be following the requirements of the Truman Doctrine, that he would not allow communism to spread any further. Now, this time the summit meeting did go ahead. There were formal talks as well as informal arrangements, but no solution was found, and both sides refused to compromise on their position. So the impact here was one of actually heightened tension. Immediately after this summit, both sides publicly increased their defence spending, and so neither side could really afford to back down in this argument. So ultimately, diplomacy had failed to find an answer. So let's look next at the building of the Berlin Wall in August 1961 to see how this crisis came to a head. So in August 1961, without any warning in advance, the Soviet forces in East Berlin closed the border with West Berlin, and a temporary barrier was put in place. Now, despite protests from the West, there was no direct American intervention. They did not attempt to stop this from happening. And in the days and weeks that followed, while the wall was strengthened, there was no intervention from America. They allowed this to happen. In the aftermath of the wall being built, there was an immediate rise in tension there was a dangerous standoff at a checkpoint, which you can just see in the bottom image. At checkpoint Charlie, there was a disagreement over access to both sides' sectors, and this came to a head where tanks were positioned facing each other over the checkpoint, and this took hours to defuse. It actually took negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev themselves to gradually withdraw their tanks. And again, this gives you an idea how neither side could be seen to lose face in Berlin. It has a highly symbolic importance to both sides. But after this short-term rise in tension, in the longer term, the building of the Berlin Wall actually served to lower tension between both sides, because it had showed the extent of the argument. There would not be a war fought over the Western presence in Berlin. And clearly Khrushchev's ultimatum and his threat to remove the West by force was not going to happen, because he had made a permanent and formal barrier between the sectors. What it did, of course, was to stop the flow of refugees. So, with people being unable to move across sectors, the flow of people out of East Germany and out of East Berlin ended. So let's look at how both leaders came out of this. For Khrushchev, there were some positives here. People had stopped leaving, so the refugee crisis came to an end. The economic recovery of East Germany started to gradually take place as fewer people were leaving. And certainly East Berlin could now be claimed to be free of Western interference. However, politically, he had not followed through on his ultimatum, and inside the Soviet Union, at the top level of the Communist Party, this was seen as a sign of weakness. He had failed to remove American troops from West Berlin, so the military presence was still there. And in the long term, the Berlin Wall became a symbol of Soviet repression, and one that the West could use as propaganda against the Soviets. It became a permanent reminder of the better living standards and freedoms of the West. And now the impacts for JFK, again, there's a mixture here of positives and negatives. He'd proved himself on the international stage. He'd proved that he could stand up to Khrushchev. The American presence in West Berlin remained, so the ultimatum hadn't been followed through, and it gave him opportunities to show that the West had material advantages over the communist world. And he made a very famous speech at the Berlin Wall in 1963, proclaiming the benefits of life in capitalist countries over life in communist countries. There are some negatives though. He hadn't been able to prevent Berlin from being formally divided, which was one of the previous agreements at the wartime conferences. And it allowed the Soviets to build the wall, and it hadn't managed to prevent that from happening. So overall, for both sides, there are positives and negatives of superpower relations. They had stopped short of armed conflict in the hottest of areas of the Cold War. This is a crucial area for both sides, but they hadn't gone to war. And it also shown that discussion between leaders, despite not being able to come up with solutions, could limit crises. But on the downside, diplomacy hadn't managed to find solutions. There was distrust and animosity between both sides over Berlin. And Berlin Wall was a permanent physical symbol of the divisions between the capitalist and the communist world. So let's see how you might use this material. Here's a past paper question. It was one of the 8-mark explain questions. And we've got explain the importance of the refugee problem in Berlin for increasing tensions between the East and West in the years 1958 to 1961. Now if you want to have a go at this question, if you remember, what you need to do is to write 2 paragraphs, and you'll need to come up with paragraphs that show how X made a difference on Y. There's much more guidance on this type of question in our other videos on the CHSG History channel. Okay, we've come to the end. Thanks very much for watching. You'll find more guidance videos and revision materials on the CHSG History YouTube channel.